Joining us now, Democratic candidate for president, former Congressman Beto O'Rourke of Texas. How are the Astros doing, Beto?
Oh, no.
Pretty good. Doing pretty good. But our congratulations to the Nationals after last night.
Well, you know, Beto, we're a little concerned that you are now, we understand today you are going to be talking about confiscating the bats from the New York Yankees, especially Aaron Judge.
Here we go.
Without just kicking down the doors. So that, of course, leads us into the question, of course, that you talked to with Mayor Pete last night. Tell us about your plan on the confiscation of guns, which obviously many believe is unconstitutional. Also very concerned that it plays right in the hands of Republican candidates.
To be clear, I'm not talking about confiscating anybody's guns, but I do think that for those weapons of war, AR-15s, AK-47s, these were designed and sold to the militaries of the world to kill people on a battlefield, and there are more than 16 million of them in America. And we've seen the devastating effect that they can have in Dayton, Ohio, or El Paso, Texas, or Odessa, not too far from where I live. Those must be bought back, or else each of them are an instrument potentially of terror in this country. And it is literally terrorizing and terrifying people throughout America. More than 80% of Hispanics in Texas fear that they will be a victim of a mass shooting attack like the one that we saw in El Paso, Texas. But, Joe, that's just part of a larger plan to reduce gun violence with universal background checks, red flag laws to stop someone who has a firearm that may harm themselves or someone else, and then ending the sale of these weapons of war to our fellow Americans. I think combined doing all of that, we will significantly reduce gun violence in America and save thousands of lives every year.
So, Congressman, so let me ask you, let's say I have an AR-15. I bought it legally 5 years ago. I'm a law-abiding citizen. You want to buy it back as President of the United States. I say no. You give me other incentives. I say no. I bought this legally. I'm keeping this. I live on a ranch. I need it for protection. What would you do then?
First of all, I wouldn't concede the point on following the law. I don't know you well, Joe, but I know you well enough to expect you to follow the law, even if it's a law that you disagree with. I think it's one of the things that distinguishes us as a country. We're a country of laws.
Okay, but let's just assume that there's a rancher in Texas that says, I'm not going to do this because this is an unjust law and it's unconstitutional. What's the next step? I think that's what we need to concede, because there will be people that don't turn their guns back in. What's the next step for the federal government there?
Yeah, I think just as in any law that is not followed or flagrantly abused, there have to be consequences, or else there is no respect for the law. So, in that case, I think there would be a visit by law enforcement to recover that firearm and to make sure that it is purchased, bought back, so that it cannot be potentially used against somebody else. But my faith is in this country and in my fellow Americans following the law and listening to people who own AK-47s and AR-15s, who acknowledge, who concede they don't need it for self-protection. They don't need it to hunt. Its real, true purpose and use is on a battlefield. And I think that's important to acknowledge, because when you talk to the people of Dayton who saw 9 gunned down in under 40 seconds, or in El Paso, 22 killed in under 3 minutes, it's hard to answer their question as to why this continues to happen, or why we would continue to allow more than 16 million of these weapons in our country. And Joe, we also have an example in Australia where those weapons of war were successfully bought back without going to a door-to-door confiscation, and where you've seen a dramatic reduction in gun violence and a dramatic reduction in mass shootings in that country.
Congressman, it's Willie Geist. Good to see you this morning. I think everyone watching this show, and I would argue almost every American, agrees with you that 40,000 gun deaths a year in this country is completely unacceptable. So I guess the question from me to you is, if you believe we should take back those semi-automatic rifles from people who have them or outlaw them, what about handguns? As you know well, because you've studied this issue, 70% of gun deaths in this country come from handguns. So if the idea is to get these guns out of the hands of people who are committing crimes and murders, why not go door to door in places like Chicago and take handguns as well?
First of all, there's a significant difference between a handgun and an AR-15. If you talk to or listen to trauma surgeons, as I have, and they describe the wounds from those weapons of war, they expel all their kinetic energy inside you. They just destroy your organs, cause you to bleed to death. Very different from what a handgun will do. And there's a legitimate use for a handgun to protect yourself in your home. So the answer to that challenge is making sure that we have true universal background checks, close all of the loopholes. And in the Chicago example, and I've talked to people in Chicago about this, you cannot have selective enforcement of those background checks, because while you may have them in Chicago, if you don't have them in Indiana or in bordering states, people are going to buy guns in those places and bring them into Chicago. We need a national system of universal background checks, and it must be complemented with red flag laws, so that if someone is displaying a tendency towards harming themselves in a country that loses 22,000 people to gun suicides or harming somebody else, then we take that weapon from them through due process before it is too late.
And I think we agree the idea is to stop gun violence, right? But so I guess my question again is, if 70% of the gun violence is coming from a particular kind of gun, a handgun, why not go all the way and take those as well?
Because I don't think that's the right thing to do. I don't think that's constitutional, and I believe that Americans should be able to own.
Why is it constitutional to take a semi-automatic rifle then? That's also protected under the Second Amendment.
Not necessarily. Even Antonin Scalia, conservative jurist on the Supreme Court, said there are some common sense limits to the Second Amendment. And at several points in American history, we have acknowledged that, with machine guns in the past, with an assault weapons ban in the mid-1990s. It was allowed to expire within a decade. And these weapons that I'm talking about, an AR-15, an AK-47, are so materially different than a shotgun or a hunting rifle or a handgun that they should be treated differently. They are weapons of war that should only be on a battlefield. I mean, 22 people killed in under 3 minutes in El Paso, Texas. When the Second Amendment was ratified and adopted, it took you 3 minutes to reload your musket. I don't know that the founding fathers could have envisioned the kind of carnage that can be produced with one of these weapons, and no civilian should own them. And I hope you all acknowledge this, every candidate on that stage is for an assault weapons ban. So if the logic is that those weapons are too dangerous to sell, and then you acknowledge that there are 16 million of them out there, you have to do something about the number of weapons that are out there. And my plan is the clearest, it is the boldest, and to your point, it is politically difficult, may not poll well, may not be politically convenient, but it's important if we're going to save the lives of our fellow Americans.
Andrea Mitchell.
Congressman, let me ask you about the age issue, which came up last night, and there was a clear generational divide between the three top frontrunners in the Democratic side and everyone else, including you. Where do you stand when Joe Biden says that his age is wisdom, it's experience, and the clear hunger of a lot of Democrats and a lot of other voters for someone younger, for change?
I really want this to be a competition of ideas and vision and track record and the path that each of us describes in order to achieve the vision that we have for America. So for me, age is irrelevant, certainly for any of the candidates who were on the stage last night. I don't think that should be a defining or a deciding factor in this race. But, some of those questions that need to be resolved, all of us want to see our fellow Americans as healthy as possible. Each of us has a plan to get there. I think that's where we should be focused on the differences and the advantages of different proposals. In my case, universal, guaranteed, high-quality health care for every single American without a middle-class tax hike. And in fact, if your family earns $250,000 or less, you will not see a tax increase in my administration? I can answer that question very clearly. Senator Warren had a hard time giving our fellow Americans that same assurance. In fact, just could not answer that question point blank. So that's where I'd like to see the focus is in the differences on policy, on vision, on path, less on age or those things that I think really are immaterial to the future of this country.
Well put. Beto O'Rourke, it's always good to see you. Thank you very much for coming on the show this morning.
And go Astros. I have no problem saying that. Let's bring in
Thank
Peter
you.
Baker.
Thank you.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.